When we're talking covenant theology and federal heads, we're talking about figures that represent others. Adam represents all who descend from him by ordinary generation. Christ represents all the elect, all who would believe in him by grace through faith and regenerated by the Spirit, etc., united to him by God's working. Israel here, when we see the nation sinning, there's a couple things to think about and questions that I may have or would like to prompt you to discuss for the benefit of our listeners. How are we to understand sin during the theocracy specifically? And at what point does an individual sin or relate to the sins of the nation? How are we to understand that, both corporate sin and corporate guilt interplaying with individuals? And then a follow-up to that, are we to make a straight line connection between how God treated the theocracy and how God might treat whatever groups in the present day? What is different? What is the same and what is different about corporate sin, corporate guilt, corporate representation?
Yeah, Camden, excellent questions. I would say this as a preface, that it would do our listeners well, as you're listening, to Google or look up, if you have it in written form, a hard copy even or something, chapter 8 of the report of the OPC Special Committee on Republication.
Yeah, we'll try to post a link to that in the description. Sure.
Yeah, it's useful. And let me just try to put it this way. God's covenant relation to his people in the Old and New Covenant is a relationship with sanctions of blessing and cursing appended. The circumcision signifies being cut off for rebellion, being covered by the blood of the Redeemer if you trust in him. That's part and parcel of that bloody sign, but it cuts two ways. Similarly, baptism represents a judgment by water ordeal that you will face alone under the wrath of God if you do not trust in the Messiah, if you do not improve it. But it symbolizes the Messiah passing through that deluge judgment for you in a manner that makes him the antitypical Noah's Ark, the one who passes through the water ordeal and includes you with him. Now, what that means is that the sin of the nation is going to bring into view elect and reprobate, because it is a national algorithm that's being used. It's not the sins of individuals isolated that is taken into account. It is the sin of the nation as a whole. And if you think of it this way, I'm just going to highlight it because you can read and get more detail in that report. You can say that the blessings and curses signified by circumcision have a unique typico-symbolic application to the nation as a whole. They are cut off, they are judged, they are made to walk between the pieces, Jeremiah 34. And the curses of the covenant are applied to them at the national and typico-symbolic level. And it's because they have despised the grace and the sacrifices and the condescension of the Lord in his covenant love. They've despised it. To use an analogy from Hebrews 10, they are treading underfoot the blood of the covenant that sanctified them.
Right.
They're doing it at a national level. And in the new covenant, it's not the case that the new covenant has only blessings, only sanctions of blessing, but not curse. Hebrews 6, 1-4, and Hebrews 10, 26-21 make it explicit that there can be and is apostasy under the new covenant for individuals. But here's the difference. The theocracy as a whole, that mode of God relating to his people in a visible holy glory realm, a theocracy, a visible temple dwelling, as it were. It is that form or mode or administration of God dealing with his people that passes away. It
Mm-hmm.
passes away in judgment. When the
Mm-hmm.
temple is destroyed, that administration of God's gracious relation to his people passes away. And so there's a corporate failure of the theocracy as a whole. There can be no corporate failure of the theocracy in its new covenant mode for the church, because the church is being raised and translated out of earth into heaven. But and the order as a whole cannot fail. It will consummate. The type can fail, the antitype cannot,
Right.
as an order
Right.
in the history of salvation. But nonetheless, individuals can be grafted out. 1 John 2:19, there can be people of us, but who show themselves not to be of us and depart. That can happen. And so I think the best way to think about the exile is it's a corporate instance of excommunication from the holy realm of Canaan that can be compared to excommunication of individuals from the holy realm of heaven.
Yeah.
And I think that's a useful way of putting it. In other words, you can explain the exile by using the logic of the covenant of grace. You don't need to posit a covenant of works to explain the exile.
Yeah.
And that chapter 8 in that volume fleshes this out more, but I believe that's the sort of answer that Voss is after here. And it's the kind of answer that's consistent with viewing the Mosaic covenant as in its substance an administration of the covenant of grace with dual sanctions.